It is now 236 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. At least 4 people, including a pregnant woman, died on Monday from a drone strike in Kiev. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says 65,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since the beginning of the invasion. Russia says that number is about 6,000. Meanwhile, 11 people are now dead, 15 wounded, after 2 gunmen launched an attack on a Russian military training center along the Ukrainian border on Saturday. A spokesperson for Russia's defense ministry says the 2 assailants were from the former Soviet Republic of Tajikistan. Vladimir Putin says he is almost done mobilizing 300,000 new troops for a winter offensive in Ukraine, and there are now reports of able-bodied Russian men being dragged from their families and forced to enlist. Hundreds of thousands of men are reportedly leaving Russia to avoid the fighting. For more on this, we'll be talking to Professor Ann Lee in about an hour. She writes over at the Daily Kos a nightly update on the war in Ukraine. Ukraine at one time was the 7th largest nation in Europe in terms of population, with more than 4,000, what am I talking about? 44 million people, but no longer. Take a look at this map of refugees. This is a graphic made available through Creative Commons. Ukraine is being emptied out. Look at those numbers. According to the UN, more than 14 million Ukrainians, 14 million Ukrainians out of a country that used to have 44 million, 14 million Ukrainians have fled since fighting began. Look at this map. Poland has taken in 6,782,000. Romania has taken in 1,324,000. Russia has taken in close to 3 million. Hungary, 1,500,000. Slovakia, 850,000. 655,000 to Moldova, and about 16,000, 17,000 into Belarus. Okay? So meanwhile, the UN said today that 4 million children living in Russia, Ukraine, and Central Europe are now living in poverty because of the fighting in Ukraine. So why is that? Why are they living in poverty? Because war drives up the cost of living. Let me put it another way. So Joe Biden, Wall Street, and the central bankers like this overdone stooge, Jerome Powell, who you can see behind me. So people like Jerome Powell can understand this. Inflation. Inflation is the cost of living. That's what inflation is. It's the cost of living. And isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting the words our anti-democratic central bankers choose? Isn't it? They use terms like inflation as opposed to the cost of living. When Russia invades Ukraine, they'll say it's Putin who is driving up the cost of living. But when the chairman of the Federal Reserve raises interest rates so workers can no longer ask for more money, he's combating inflation. He's fighting inflation. This is what Jerome Powell has clearly said. He says he is raising interest rates to cool off the economy in order to bring down wage inflation. He said that. He's not going to bring down the cost of college, healthcare, or our rent. That's not what he wants to do, and that's not what he can do. He wants to bring down wages, and he wouldn't dare call that the cost of living. He calls that inflation, because if he were to call it the cost of living, then people would draw a connection between the actions of our central bankers and life or death, right? Wages is the difference between life and death. What you get paid or don't get paid is the difference between life and death. So you're not going to call this the cost of living. You're going to call it something more anodyne, like inflation. He calls it inflation because in America, If we cared about what it costs to live, we wouldn't have a central banker right now putting downward pressure on wages. If we called it the cost of living as opposed to inflation, instead of raising and lowering interest rates, which has no effect whatsoever on inflation, Americans, we wouldn't leave it to the central bankers to measure and then supposedly ameliorate the cost of living. What do these bankers know about the cost of living? What could Jerome Powell possibly know about the cost of living? JP Morgan Chase reported its third quarter earnings last week, and they came in way beyond expectations. And Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, says he's expecting a very profitable end of the year, and he's expecting 2023 to be even more profitable. Why? Because he says during the earnings call that banks benefit when the Fed raises interest rates. When the Fed raises interest rates, it means banks can charge more for loans. But try putting your money into a savings account with JP Morgan Chase. Good luck getting interest rates that reflect those rising interest rates that Jerome Powell is forcing on us. Right now, you're lucky if you have any money to save. You're lucky if you can get 2.5% if you deposit it in a savings account at JP Morgan Chase. Banks no longer pay you to deposit money the way they used to. So interest rate hikes only benefit the banks because that's who Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, that's who he works for. The banks, right? He raises interest rates. So now if you want a loan, they charge you more. They charge you more on your credit card. But if you're lucky enough to have some cash left over and put it into a savings account, you don't get high interest rates on your deposits. Jerome Powell isn't fighting the high cost of living. He doesn't care if you live or die, and he's not fighting inflation. So let's talk about the cost of living or inflation. Okay, let's talk about what it actually costs to stay alive. The cost of living would go down dramatically if Joe Biden put an end to the fighting in Ukraine. I started talking about Ukraine. It's about inflation. It's all related. Where are the peace talks? This is a grinding war of attrition. What we've got going on in Ukraine is a grinding war of attrition. General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said so 2 months ago. All you need to do is listen to what these people say, right? Jerome Powell says, I'm raising interest rates to lower wages. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, 2 months ago said, short of negotiation, this war in Ukraine will be one of grinding attrition. Land lost, land regained, land lost, land regained. Wars like the one that's going on in Ukraine, they never end. They never end because there's too much at stake now for too many stakeholders. Now, what do I know? I'm an idiot. Maybe there'll be a coup and Putin will be relieved of his duties and there'll be peace. What do I know? What do I know other than war, all war, is the promise of victory just around the corner. This war in Ukraine ain't ending until America gets involved by stopping it. This war will not end until America says enough. Most Americans polled say enough, which is why we never vote on a war. We never ask the American people, do you want to go to war? Congress really doesn't declare war anymore, do they? They give a war authorization, but they don't want to dirty their hands with this perpetual state of war America finds itself in. This war has to stop. 14 million refugees have left Ukraine. That doesn't count the millions still in Ukraine who have been displaced. That's 3 times the number of Syrian refugees. Remember the civil war in Syria? Remember all the refugees that came flooding into Europe, that are still coming into Europe? This is 3 times the number of Syrian refugees. We're talking about 14 million refugees who have left Ukraine. What are we talking about if not the 14 million refugees who have left Ukraine? What does victory look like? I know what defeat looks like. I can turn on the news. What does victory look like for America in Ukraine? What does victory look like for Western Europe in Ukraine? Again, I'm rooting for Zelensky. I think the world would be better off without Vladimir Putin. But we all know that this war in Ukraine is a proving ground for American weapons. I talked about this on the show countless times last week. Professor Ann Lee, who'll be joining us in an hour, we talked about this last week. She pointed out that weapons can only be tested. You only know if they work when you put them through real life battle situations. We are using Ukraine to test our anti-ballistic missiles that we're selling to Taiwan and Japan and the rest of Europe. If you work for Raytheon, you are monitoring this war very closely and learning to adjust your anti-ballistic missiles to make sure they work in real conditions so you can sell them to other countries. Ukraine is a proving ground for American weapons manufacturers, the same way Hitler used Spain as a proving ground for his weapons. This is what's partly going on in Ukraine. I can assure you there is no victory in this war or any war, just record profits. The cost of living is going up, and so are corporate profits. Stock market was up nearly 3% today, and it's earnings season. See, it's all out in the open. All you have to do is pay attention to earnings season. And they tell us inflation is eating into profits. Doesn't seem so. Stock market's up. There's a kind of inflation that Jerome Powell and the central bankers are actually quite fond of, and that is the rising price of stocks. They don't complain about that inflation. End the war in Ukraine. End it, and that will lower the cost of food and the cost of oil. Now, I'll keep repeating this because I'm stunned that most people don't know this. 1/3 of inflation is what it costs to rent, not what it costs to buy a house, what it costs to rent a house, to rent an apartment. 1/3 of how we measure inflation is what does it cost to rent. I will be a broken record on this. Half the people who rent in America live at or below the poverty line. So you want to fight inflation? It has nothing to do with raising and lowering interest rates. It's rent control. It's forbidding landlords like Blackstone, which at one time was the biggest landlord in Spain. It's forbidding out-of-state, out-of-country landlords from jacking up the price of rent. Problem solved. You've cured inflation, but they're not going to do that. You end the war, you solve inflation. When you have 16 million Ukrainians displaced, refugees, that creates increased demand for housing in Central Europe. So rents go up. The key drivers of inflation are rent, food, and oil. You put an end to this war, you've kicked inflation's ass. F. Jerome Powell. All he wants to do is put downward pressure on wages. He doesn't give a rat's ass about the cost of living. The International Monetary Fund said this week, the single largest cause of inflation is the war in Ukraine. That's the International Monetary Fund. You know, the gangsters, the loan sharks, even the mobsters are saying the single largest cause of inflation is the war in Ukraine. So when does this war end? It doesn't. It doesn't end. Wars like this don't end. It's a mobster bust out. That's what it is. It's an old-fashioned bust out. These wars go on for years. This is a border conflict. Border conflicts last forever. The war between Iraq and Iran lasted 8 years, with America, by the way, providing weapons to both sides. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979, and they finally left Afghanistan in 1989. And we know how well that turned out for Russia and for America, which funded the Mujahideen, which turned into Al-Qaeda. These wars never end. Ukraine isn't ending anytime soon. And I fall prey to it, right? I pick up the paper. Oh, they took parts of Kherson. We're winning. No, we're not winning. Nobody wins a war. America's invasion of Iraq started in 2003. The fighting continues, just not with American troops. That war isn't ending. America, our invasion of Afghanistan, what did that last? 20 years? That war isn't ending. You know what will end? American interest. You and me will move on. I can't tell you who the president of Iraq is. Did you know that it is officially a theocratic Muslim nation? It's written into our constitution. Did anybody ever tell you that Iraq is officially a Muslim country? One of the reasons we went there was to put an end to theocracies. Read the Constitution of Iraq. So the fighting will continue. The fighting will continue because wars never end. Fighting will continue in Syria, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Gaza. But we will move on. We as Americans who finance so much of this war and profit off so much of this war will move on. You know, when it comes to the granular specifics, we will be tricked into compartmentalizing each conflict. You know, we'll forget who's fighting who, and we'll focus on our own problems, like inflation, right? We have to worry about inflation. Yes, we have to bring down our prices, right? That's the problem. And we will be lied to about inflation. They will ensnare the gullible, of which there are many, and say, for example, the only way to bring down the cost of oil is...
We just need to drill, baby, drill!
Yeah. That would be Sarah Palin, who's campaigning for Congress right now. Drill, baby, drill. What this miserable, Botox-soaked runt of the protozoan litter, she was the runt of the protozoan litter when she was born. She doesn't know when she says drill, baby, drill, but she doesn't know because she's too stupid to know this. She doesn't know that President Barack Obama, as a favor to struggling oil companies, pegged the price of America's domestic oil to the world market. So no matter how much we drill, baby, drill, the price of oil isn't going to be set by domestic demand. Even though it comes from America, that oil, what we pay for it, depends on OPEC. It's pegged to the world market, which means OPEC sets the price of oil by turning on or off the spigot. So we can't drill, baby, drill our way out of this, you idiot. What we can do is get off this fetid crap, fossil fuels, before we all die. We need to stop fighting wars for oil, and we need to get off oil. People are dying from oil, and they are dying for oil. We're dying for something that's killing us. Now, Ukraine, what nobody talks about, is about partly, maybe mostly, about oil and gas. Nobody ever mentions that, do they? Ukraine has the second biggest known gas reserves in all of Europe. 1 trillion cubic meters of natural gas reserves, 9 billion tons of oil sitting underneath Ukraine that we know about. This is mostly, partly about oil and gas. And trust me, if the military tells you this war isn't about oil and gas, it's about oil and gas. You cannot separate war from oil and gas. You cannot separate climate catastrophe from oil and gas. And you cannot separate war from the high price of oil and gas, which means you cannot separate war, climate catastrophe from inflation, period. War causes inflation, period. Period. The single biggest driver of inflation, actually, it's the second biggest driver of inflation now. It's changed. I'll tell you who the first biggest driver of inflation is in a second. The second biggest driver of inflation worldwide is war. You want to bring down inflation? End the war. End the war in Ukraine. Joe Biden pushing for these weapons being sent to Ukraine. He's the divorce attorney telling me to keep fighting. Fight, David. You need to fight. She can't get away with this. And so, on principle, the divorce attorney convinces me, on principle, I must fight until there's nothing left to fight over. Joe Biden is a divorce attorney. He's saying to Ukraine, fight, 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 until the divorce lawyer can no longer be paid because there's nothing left. So he washes his hands of the situation. I offered you justice, but all you cared about was revenge. You were unfocused. Get yourself a new lawyer. And then you get your divorce and you ask, what was that all about? Why am I broke? Because the divorce attorney, Joe Biden, wouldn't let you settle. Because there's too much money to be made in prolonging the fighting. That's what divorce attorneys do, and that's what America does with our military-industrial complex and Blackstone and the investors who are meeting secretly with Zelensky. Not so secretly. Blackstone is holding high-level meetings with Zelensky right now on how to rebuild Ukraine after we've destroyed it. It's like Halliburton and Dick Cheney rebuilding, thinking they were going to rebuild Iraq and get the oil wells after we destroyed it. You get paid destroying the country, and then you get paid rebuilding the country after you destroyed it. Nice racket we got going here in America. I just wish we could get rich off this. You know, people say, well, you like the way you live here in America, don't? No, I don't like the way I live here. Where's all this? Where's all the treasure we're supposedly looting from these countries? I'm not seeing it. War is the second biggest driver of inflation in America. And, inflation, they tell you it's bad. You know who benefits from inflation? Wealthy people, because higher prices mean higher yields on their investments and more money in profits. Pay attention. It's earnings season on Wall Street. I know it's too complicated, right? Pay attention to earnings season. Inflation is hurting corporate America. You know who suffers from inflation? Everybody else. Not the rich, not the big corporations. Everybody else suffers because they can't afford anything. The rich and the powerful, they pay think tanks to blame inflation on higher wages, right? This inflation, it only screws over the poor and the working people who are made to feel guilty because they want to be paid more because they can't keep up with inflation. And they're fed this lie by these corporate funded think tanks that inflation is caused by unions and workers wanting more money. War is good for the wealthy because during the war they make money, and then right after the war they make even more because war causes inflation to skyrocket. And that's good for the wealthy. After World War II, when price controls ended, inflation in America jumped to 28%. War causes inflation. A year after America entered the Korean War, inflation jumped to 21%. America finally pulled out of Vietnam on March 29th, 1973. Inflation at that time was about 9%. It's pretty high. And that was with Nixon's wage and price freezes, which after we pulled out of Vietnam, those wage and price freezes were lifted and inflation jumped to 11% a year after we pulled out. War is the second biggest driver of inflation. And the rich love inflation. They love skyrocketing prices of stocks, real estate, art, homes, watches, baseball cards. They love inflation because they love making more money. People are willing to pay more for what they already own. The rich and powerful love inflation. In the 70s, they were getting double-digit returns on T-bills. So war is the second biggest driver of inflation. Let me repeat. You want to beat inflation? End the war in Ukraine. But you know what the single biggest driver of inflation is? Oil. Not what we pay for oil at the pump. I'm talking about what we pay for oil in the way of climate catastrophe. The single biggest driver of inflation is climate catastrophe. But the Federal Reserve is not going to say that. Wall Street won't say that. They'll say it's supply chain issues. They'll say inflation is caused by supply chain issues and not the man-made flooding, not the man-made fires. It's not caused, the supply chain issues aren't caused by the man-made drought, right? If they said these supply chain issues were caused by climate catastrophe, which they are, then too many people would start to think, maybe we should get off fossil fuels. Okay? You don't have to be an economist to figure out that supply chain issues drive up inflation, and these supply chain issues are caused by climate catastrophe. In fact, only a person who's not an economist is allowed to figure that out. These supply chain issues that they'll say, it's caused by the war in Ukraine. Partly true, but on a much bigger scale, these supply chain issues are caused by climate catastrophe. The war in Ukraine causes supply chain issues. COVID causes supply chain issues. Climate change is World War III through World War 300. COVID and the war in Ukraine cannot compete with the supply chain issues caused by climate catastrophe, and therefore this inflation that raising or lowering interest rates is not going to tackle. The oil and gas industry is waging war against our planet. And that war against our planet is causing inflation on a massive scale beyond anything our economic system, the people who run it, can comprehend. The geniuses at Davos, Jerome Powell, head of our Federal Reserve, Liz Truss, the new prime minister, the head of lettuce in Great Britain, and whoever the chancellor of the exchequer in Great Britain is today, they do not have the vocabulary to deal with the economic fallout from climate catastrophe because they are the cause of climate catastrophe. All they're trained to do is make it worse and then point fingers at the people who don't cause climate catastrophe and say they're responsible for inflation. They will recognize supply chain issues, but they refuse to accept that these supply chain issues stem from oil and gas, and only oil and gas. And at the very root of these supply chain issues, if you dig down to the source of our supply chain issues, you will strike oil and you will strike gas, because oil and gas is the cause of all our supply chain issues. Therefore, oil and gas is the cause of inflation. It's the cause of war. It's the cause of climate catastrophe. War and climate catastrophe are the two biggest drivers of inflation, and the people in charge lack the vocabulary to admit or understand that. Supply chain issues, these are choke points that make it impossible for food, clothing, cars, steel, chips, lumber to get produced and make it to market. Climate catastrophe is making it worse, and the worse it gets, the worse our supply chain issues become, and inflation goes up and up and up. Remember Hurricane Ian down in Florida? I think it happened like 2 weeks ago. It's old news. What do you think that does to the cost of oranges? Or a trip to Disneyland? Have you priced a trip to Disneyland? Why do you think Disneyland has gotten so expensive? Why? Because they're paying the people who live in their cars so much. If you work for Disneyland, chances are you're living in your car in Orlando. You think that's what's causing the ticket prices to go up at Disneyland, what they pay their workers? It's climate change. China is the largest producer of solar panels, but extreme heat is forcing their factories to shut down because of unsafe working conditions, and Chinese workers have to ration power in the factories due to water shortages, climate change related water shortages that make it impossible to power China's hydroelectric dams. So the price of solar panels goes up. Drought in Europe, caused by man-made climate catastrophe. Drought in Europe means food prices are going up. Drought in Europe means energy prices are going up because there isn't enough water to produce hydroelectric power. And the water in France now is too hot to cool off the nuclear reactors. So the price of energy from nuclear reactors is going up. Massive drought throughout Europe and the American West is destroying our crops. And that drives up the cost of food. The people who work the fields now, and yes, I know it's hard for Americans to believe, but they are people and they suffer from heat stroke. Vegetables are left to rot here in America because it's too dangerous to pick them. Cattle are dying because there's no water to feed them. And that is all because of climate catastrophe. It is all because of the oil companies. Massive flooding, destroying factories in Pakistan this year, are creating shortages of stuff that they make in Pakistan for us here in America. And when there's a shortage of stuff, the price of stuff goes up. This isn't really a supply chain issue. This is scarcity caused by climate catastrophe. Wake up, people. Wake up. Wake up. This inflation is the scarcity they warned us about when they said things are going to get bad because of climate catastrophe. Jerome Powell, nobody on Wall Street will admit this because they can't, but the single biggest driver of inflation is climate catastrophe. And if you don't know that, you're the problem. You're the problem for not knowing that. Everything costs more because there's less of it. This is the scarcity they told us about. This is what happens with climate catastrophe, and it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. And we're going to fight wars over water. But because we're so effing stupid, nobody will say that this war is about climate catastrophe, right? We will fight wars because the mighty Colorado is drying up, and northern Mexico needs the mighty Colorado. And we will accuse them of stealing water somehow from the mighty Colorado. Or California will take arms against Arizona, fighting over the mighty Colorado. And we will fight and we will kill each other over water because that's what we can control. We can control the killing of one another. We can't control the oil companies who caused all of this, but we can control killing one another. This is what is going to happen. This is what is going to happen because of people like Jerome Powell, who won't talk about climate catastrophe. But still, we listen to Jerome Powell. We hang on every wet drip of effluvium that Jerome Powell lets rip from his putrid sphincter of a mouth. He's meeting right now with the other clown car of Federal Reserve bankers to decide how much they should raise interest rates because the economy is running too hot. No, you delusional prick. It's the planet, not the economy. It's the planet that's running too hot. If Jerome Powell were any dumber, he'd be running for the Republican nominee for president in 2024. Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve bankers and the bankers they answer to, like Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, who says divesting his investment portfolio of fossil fuels is, quote, the highway to hell. They are pieces of shit, and they are murderous pieces of shit. Murderous pieces of shit. They are getting us killed. Sarah Bloom Raskin was appointed by Joe Biden to become a vice chair of the Federal Reserve this year. She's a good person. She's married to Jamie Raskin. She's not just a good person, she's a great person. we should be listening to her. She was going to sit on the Federal Reserve this year, but she had to withdraw her nomination due to pressure from the oil companies and their handmaiden, Senator Joe Manchin, who is the single largest recipient of fossil fuel money. So why couldn't Ms. Raskin sit on the Federal Reserve? Because during hearings this year before Congress, Sarah Raskin said that the Federal Reserve must police climate change. She made the mistake of saying that for the sake of financial stability, the banks must draw a direct connection between climate change and economic instability. And that was deemed unacceptable. No, there must not be a direct correlation made between climate catastrophe and inflation. We can't have this talk, said Joe Manchin. Senator Joe Manchin insisted that Biden withdraw Sarah Bloom Raskin's name, and she gave up. And what does this piece of shit, Joe Manchin, think is the single biggest driver of inflation? Well, he doesn't think it, but he says it. He says it's government spending. That's what he says is the biggest single driver of inflation. Yes, food stamps, a social safety net. That's what's causing inflation. That's what's causing all these supply chain issues. That's why we're paying so much for lumber and chips and food, because food stamps. That's what's causing inflation. You effing piece of shit. The social safety net has nothing to do with inflation. It's war. That's what causes inflation, you idiot. It's rent. And most importantly, it's the supply chain issues caused by oil and gas. But, they'll blame food stamps. They blame the earned income tax credit for children. Children getting $300, $600 a month. That's what's causing the inflation, you fucking pieces of shit. You fucking pieces of shit. You murderous fucking pieces of shit. They blame the unions. They say we can't increase the minimum wage. All because of inflation. It's horseshit. Inflation is caused by war, rent, and most importantly, climate change. That's it. Jerome Powell, the head of the Federal Reserve, is raising interest rates for the sole purpose of lowering wages. That's it. Because they don't want Americans comfortable. Because if Americans get comfortable, we have time to read, we have time to think, and we have time to realize what they're telling us about inflation and its relation to the social safety net is pure, unadulterated, murderous horse shit. Murderous horse shit. Inflation, and I'll keep repeating it, is caused by three things: rent, war, and most importantly, climate catastrophe. We could bring down the cost of living if we ended the wars, had rent freezes, and outlawed the oil companies. But this government can't tame the military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel industry, or the people who own real estate, because this government is the military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel industry, and the people who own real estate. So, when we see inflation, we have to blame the single mom who won't get a job. The minimum wage in America is a little above $7.25 an hour. Nearly half the states in America have the federal minimum wage. They don't go above it, $7.25 an hour. You work a 40-hour week, that's $290 a week. Right? A single mom works, gets the minimum wage in half the states in this country. That's $290 a week. And if you apply for food stamps, SNAP, currently gives you $4 a day because Joe Biden raised it to $4 a day. Can Jerome Powell live on $4 a day for food? Yeah, if he switched to a plant-based diet. But this government, they make it impossible to switch to a plant-based diet. They want you eating dairy, cows, and chicken, even though the UN says 14% of greenhouse gases are caused by man's consumption of livestock. We burn the rainforests to make room for cattle. Not only that, we burn the rainforests to make room for soybeans to feed to the cattle, and then feed the cattle that ate the soybeans to ourselves. Very efficient. Makes absolutely no sense. Of course, it makes no sense.